Hello, everyone. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. This is Hallie Cloud, and we welcome you to Health Reform Beyond the Basics. Um, Beyond the Basics is a project of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It is designed to provide training and resources to facilitate enrollment in the health insurance marketplace and Medicaid. We provide these resources to healthcare assistants, advocates, state and local officials, and really anyone who's helping people get and keep their health coverage. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is a nonprofit policy organization, and it is not a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This webinar is also not intended for press purposes. As always, we are recording this webinar and we will circulate both a copy of the webinar slides, the video, and any additional resources that we talk about during this. You'll have access to all of that. We post everything to our Beyond the Basics website at healthreformbeyondthebasics.org. And I will put a copy of the slides, of a PDF of the slides, in the chat in just a moment after the intro. Next slide, please. Right now, all participants are muted and in listen-only mode. They'll stay that way throughout the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon in the control panel at the bottom of your webinar toolbar, and you can type your question into that box. We're going to be monitoring questions throughout the presentation, and we will pause to answer a few questions. We have a lot to get through today, so we won't be able to answer every question. So if you have additional questions, if your question doesn't get answered, please email us at beyondthebasics@cvpp.org, and we'll answer questions that way. We also will have a record of all of your questions and try to incorporate them into future presentations and resources. Next slide, please. Today's webinar, we're going to be talking about an overview of immigration status, we're going to provide an overview of immigration status related eligibility requirements for Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and coverage through the marketplace. Today, we have a really special presenter, Gabrielle Lessard, who is the Senior Policy Attorney at the National Immigration Law Center. And we also have Shelby Gonzales, who is Vice President for Immigration Policy here at the Center on Budget. And we're just so excited to have you guys here. So I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, Hallie. Good morning, everybody from California anyway. Next slide, please. So we're going to be covering immigrant eligibility today. And just to note that on an issue that people are sometimes confused about, having an eligible immigration status doesn't necessarily mean that the person is eligible for the benefit, because they also need to meet any other income or other eligibility requirements in addition to the immigration status. We're starting with the marketplace. The marketplace uses a lawfully present standard for determining whether people are eligible. This is actually a more expansive eligibility standard than is used in Medicaid. So all of the people who are eligible, whose immigration status makes them eligible for Medicaid, are also eligible for marketplace coverage if they're, for example, over income for Medicaid. So people who are eligible for Medicaid are considered qualified immigrants. This is the distinction that was put into the law in 1996. And those qualified immigrants are generally lawful permanent residents. That's sometimes referred to as people who have green cards, as well as people who have been granted permission to either come to or remain in the United States for various humanitarian reasons. So they include refugees, people granted asylum, people who are considered Cuban or Haitian entrants, people who have been paroled into the US for a period that is expected to last at least a year. Parole in the immigration context has nothing to do with criminal parole. It is a process of being allowed to come to the United States for humanitarian reasons without meeting all of the requirements that would normally apply. Conditional entrance, you're unlikely to see. That was from the law before 1980, people granted withholding of deportation or withholding of removal are actually similar to refugees in the sense that they are people who cannot be removed from the United States because they would face death or persecution in their home country. Certain battered immigrants, as well as their children or parents, depending upon their particular status, and then survivors of trafficking, as well as their family members, and people who are migrants under the Compact of Free Association, which is an agreement that we have with certain Pacific Island nations. Members of federally recognized Indian tribes and American Indians born in Canada are also considered eligible immigrants for purposes of the Affordable Care Act. Other statuses that are not within the definition of qualified immigrants, but who are eligible for marketplace coverage, include people who are granted relief under the Convention Against Torture, people granted temporary protected status and deferred enforced departure. These are temporary statuses granted to people who are in the United States when something happens in their home country that makes it unsafe to return there. People granted deferred action, which is discretionary relief against any kind of enforcement activity, generally granted on a case-by-case basis. But there's a significant exception here for people who are granted DACA. DACA recipients were excluded by regulation from the definition of lawfully present under the Affordable Care Act. So DACA recipients are people that in particular you will want to look out for when you're assisting people in enrolling, because they will have Social Security numbers and otherwise look like other people who are lawfully present. People paroled in for less than a year, people with a variety of different non-immigrant status. This includes people who have worker visas, people who have visas for victims of crimes, people who have student visas. There are a number of different types of those visas. People who have been granted a deferral or stay on an order of removal, which is what the law currently calls deportation. And then lawful temporary residence and family unity were temporary statuses granted people under some amnesty programs in 1986 and 2000. Again, those are people you're unlikely to see. Next slide. People who are applying for immigration statuses are also often eligible for marketplace coverage. In some cases, they're required to have employment authorization. So people who have applied for lawful permanent resident status, who have an approved visa petition, are eligible, as well as people who have applied for special immigrant juvenile status. That is a form of relief that's granted to children who are abused or abandoned by their parents, people who are applying for T visas, and then people who are applying for humanitarian relief under withholding of deportation, removal, or the Convention Against Torture. People who are applying for status who require employment authorization to be eligible for marketplace coverage include people applying for temporary protected status, people applying for registry. That is a form of relief granted to people who've continuously resided in the United States since 1972. People applying for an order of supervision. That's another different form of humanitarian relief granted to people who can't safely return to their home country. People who are in the process of applying for cancellation of removal or suspension of deportation, applicants for legalization under IRCA, which is the 1986 law, and the Life Act, which is the 2000 law. Again, you're unlikely to see. And then applicants for asylum. Now, applicants for asylum will not always be adults or otherwise able to get a work permit. So in the case of asylum applicants, people who have been granted employment authorization or if they're under the age of 14 and have had an application pending for at least 180 days, are eligible for marketplace coverage. And I want to note that you should not expect to come out of this presentation with all of these different statuses committed to memory. This is just a way of familiarizing you with who's eligible and providing you with the slides for reference. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to shift to Medicaid and CHIP eligibility. Next slide, please. All right, so as I noted before, qualified immigrants are a subset of lawfully present immigrants, and that particular subset was defined by the 1996 welfare reform laws. So only the qualified immigrant people are eligible for Medicaid and CHIP. Next slide. So qualified immigrants, again, include lawful permanent residents. Again, those are also called people who have green cards, as well as the humanitarian statuses that we went over previously, and people who are migrants under the Compact of Free Association. It's important to note, if you do enrollment for different kinds of benefits, that COFA migrants are considered qualified immigrants for Medicaid purposes only, and not for other benefits such as SNAP. And then again, the Native Americans and Native Canadians are also considered lawfully or eligible immigrants for Medicaid and CHIP purposes. Next slide. Now, even if a person has a qualified immigration status, they can be subject to a 5-year waiting period before they're eligible for benefits. That 5-year period begins to run when the person obtains a qualified immigration status and enters the United States. So, for example, many family-based immigrants will actually come to the United States with lawful permanent resident status. That 5-year clock will begin to run when they come to the country. There are a number of exceptions to that 5-year bar, and that they include people who were in the US before the law passed that imposed that bar, as well as humanitarian immigrants with refugee or asylee status, as well as people granted withholding of deportation and removal. And that exception to the 5-year bar remains in effect even after they obtain lawful permanent resident status. Cuban Haitian entrants, people who have credit for 40 quarters of earnings in the United States. So that's people who have worked for 10 years or who have obtained the credit for those years of work through a spouse or parent, are exempt from the 5-year bar. People who are coming from Iraq or Afghanistan with special immigrant status. This is a new status that was created to create a pathway to citizenship for people who assisted the US military during the wars in those countries. And then people from Afghanistan or Ukraine who have been paroled into the United States between certain dates. You can read that in the footnote. Trafficking and domestic violence survivors, as well as people who are US veterans or on active duty military and their immediate family members. And then at the option of individual states, which we'll talk about on the next slide, children and pregnant people might also be exempt from that 5-year bar. Next slide. Okay, so under Medicaid and CHIP, states have the option to cover children and or pregnant people with lawfully present status. So if you think about that picture that kind of looks like a blue fried egg, there's the smaller circle of people with qualified status, and then the larger circle of people who are lawfully present. If a state elects this option, then they can cover that larger circle of lawfully present people. So that includes covering people who are qualified immigrants, including lawful permanent residents, without the 5-year bar. And then also people who are in the broader lawfully present immigration status above and beyond, or in addition to, the qualified immigrant status. 2/3 of states have taken up this option for children, and nearly half for pregnant people. And this is an option that comes with federal matching funds. And if your state has not taken it up, and we have, if you look at the link at the bottom of the page, we have some maps that make it very clear which states have and have not. This is something that really everyone should advocate for. And then in addition, there is an option through CHIP for states to provide prenatal care and certain other pregnancy-related services to people regardless of their immigration status during pregnancy. This is, again, something that comes with federal matching funds. In addition, states can use their own money to cover individuals who do not meet the standards for receiving federally matched services. And a growing number of states are doing this to provide medical care to children, seniors, and other people who are not eligible for federally funded healthcare programs. Next slide. All right, looking at an example, we have a family. Ricky and Ava are married, and they have a daughter, Karina. Ricky has been a lawful permanent resident for 2 years. Ava is also an immigrant, but she has completed the naturalization process, which means that she has become a U.S. citizen, and Karina was presumably born here and has U.S. citizenship. Everyone is looking at applying for coverage. Next slide. So starting with Ricky, Ricky's applying for coverage, but he is not a U.S. citizen. He is a lawful permanent resident, which means he's a qualified immigrant. However, as a lawful permanent resident who doesn't meet any of the exceptions, he is subject to the 5-year bar. He's only been an LPR for 2 years, so he hasn't met that 5-year bar. He is lawfully residing, and he is probably eligible for marketplace coverage. Ava is applying for coverage. She's a citizen, so we don't need to look at any of the other questions. Depending upon her income and what state she's in, she might be eligible for either Medicaid or marketplace coverage. Karina is applying for coverage. She's a citizen. And again, depending on her income or the household's income, may be eligible for Medicaid or CHIP or marketplace coverage. Next slide. Okay, I will turn it over to Shelby at this point.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Gabrielle and Hallie. I'm super excited to be part of this presentation today, and I wish everyone an upcoming successful open enrollment season. I am going to go through some special rules that apply to immigrants and their families in the marketplace. And in some cases, the rules I'm going to go through may seem to kind of contradict other rules that we think about when we are helping people apply for health coverage. Next slide, please. So first, there's a special rule around premium tax credit eligibility for people who are lawfully present but are ineligible for Medicaid due to their immigration status. So typically, you would have to have income above the poverty line, above 100% of the federal poverty line, in order to qualify for a premium tax credit. This is why in some states that have not expanded Medicaid, people are caught in what we call a coverage gap, right? So this is not the case for individuals who are lawfully present but who have income below the poverty line. And the reason is because when the ACA was being developed, right, everybody presumed, all the lawmakers presumed, that there would be some type of coverage for everybody who was lawfully present in the US and that met all the other requirements. And so they assumed that they knew that there were going to be many lawfully present people who were not going to meet the very strict Medicaid immigration related requirements to enroll in Medicaid. And there was zero desire to get more people to be eligible for Medicaid, in terms of, being able to open up Medicaid eligibility for more immigrants at that time. The political structure just was not going to make that happen. So instead, what they did was they said, okay, we're going to have this exception. So if an individual is lawfully present but does not meet the strict Medicaid eligibility rules around immigration status, they're going to be able to get premium tax credits even if their income falls below the poverty line. So who does this include? It includes individuals who have who do not have a qualified immigration status. So you heard, and you know, Gabrielle talk about this in the previous slides, and you saw a chart that showed here is a smaller group of individuals who have a qualified immigration status, and here are lots of other other kinds of statuses that would still make somebody meet the definition for lawfully present or lawfully residing, which are many, many more different immigration statuses, right? So that's one group. The other group will be people who do have a qualified immigration status, but they are subject to the 5-year bar, but they have not met the 5-year bar yet, right? So the bottom line is that there are many people who have a lawfully present or lawfully residing status and who have incomes that are in the Medicaid range or whose income is below 100% of the federal poverty line, and they are eligible for premium tax credits or cost sharing reductions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through an example of how this might play out in a family. We have Gina and Adnan who are married and they have a son named Sam. And Gina has temporary protected status, and Adnan entered the US as a refugee 4 years ago. He gained his lawful permanent resident status last year, and Sam, their child, has US citizenship status and is already enrolled in CHIP, so we are not looking for coverage for Sam, only focused on Gina and Adnan at this time. And Gina and Adnan are full-time college students, and they both work part-time, and they projected their income will be at 90% of the federal poverty line. So they are an example of a couple of a family with income below the poverty line. Next slide, please. So what will happen when we're just looking at eligibility based off of immigration and citizenship status? So first we'll look at Adnan, and he is applying for coverage. He's not a citizen. He has both refugee status and he is a lawful permanent resident. He is he meets the definition of qualified immigrant. He is subject to he's not subject to the 5-year bar. So no for that question, because he has refugee status. So even when an individual changes their status to become a lawful permanent resident, if they had refugee status, they are they're not subject to the 5-year bar, even if they later on change their status to become a lawful permanent resident. Okay, so that protection carries over. So that's important to note. So based off of what we know about his immigration status, we know that he meets the he meets the Medicaid and marketplace eligibility rules for based off of immigration status eligibility. Next, we're going to look at, I can't remember her name. We will look at Gina, I believe. We'll call her Gina. She's applying for coverage. She's not a US citizen. She has temporary protected status, which is not one of the statuses that are listed as a qualified immigrant. So it's not relevant whether or not she's subject to the 5-year bar, because we know you have to be in one of those statuses that are qualified immigrant before we even begin to ask the question as to whether or not the individual is subject to the 5-year bar or has met the 5-year bar. So she is lawfully residing, lawfully present. Her status meets that standard of eligibility. And so what we know is that she meets the standard of eligibility based off of immigration status for marketplace coverage. Next slide, please. And I remembered the name correctly. Yay, it was Gina. So first, let's look at how this plays out in a state that has expanded Medicaid. So Adnan has lawful permanent resident status and he entered the US as a refugee. He's not subject to the 5-year bar. His household income is below 138% of the federal poverty line. So in his case, he's eligible for Medicaid, okay? We're in a state, in this example, that has expanded Medicaid, which most have, thank goodness. Next, we'll look at Gina. And she has a status, immigration status that is lawfully residing and lawfully present, but she does not have a status that is considered qualified for purposes of Medicaid eligibility. She is eligible for enrollment in the marketplace, and she's eligible for premium tax credits, even though her income is below 100% of the federal poverty line. And this is because she's ineligible for Medicaid based off of her immigration status, okay? So we have two very different eligibility scenario, outcomes for this family. Even though their income is at the same level, it's all about their immigration status here. But the good news is for this family, both individuals have coverage in one place or the other. Now let's look in the next slide at what happens in a state that has not expanded Medicaid. So in this slide, we have Adnan, who is a lawful permanent resident, and he entered as a refugee. He's not subject to the 5-year bar, right? He meets the Medicaid immigration status requirement, but his state has not expanded Medicaid. So he actually is in the coverage gap. And he is not eligible for premium tax credits because his income is below 100% of the federal poverty line. And he he is, he is in the coverage gap, just as if a US citizen was applying for coverage. So he's in the coverage gap. And there's no change in eligibility for Gina in this scenario. She continues to be eligible for premium tax credits in this scenario because nothing has changed for her. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go through a scenario that sometimes comes up for older adults. So older adults who are not eligible for premium-free Medicare Part A, some may be eligible for enrollment in marketplace plans, and in some cases, they might even be eligible for premium tax credits or cost-sharing reductions. To qualify for premium-free Medicare Part A, individuals would have had to have worked a significant number of years in the United States, and they would have had to earn Social Security quarters of earnings, or they would have had to have gotten credits for maybe their spouse had gotten these quarters of earnings. So the two ways that individuals would be able to get enough kind of work history, quarters of earnings would be either because of their own work that they did in the US, paying into the Social Security system and Medicare through their payroll taxes, or individuals because they were married to somebody who their work history is applicable to them. Okay. Next slide, please. We're going to go through an example. So in this case, we have Lynn, who's 74, and he lives with his daughter, May, and grandson, Michael. Lynn has had lawful permanent resident status for 4 years, and he's never worked in the United States, okay? And I say this, in this example, he's never worked in the US. At 74, it's very unlikely that he is going to ever enroll Medicare, premium-free Medicare Part A, right, without a premium. Just because it takes a long time to get that work history, and we're going to assume that he does not have credits from a spouse. So he receives $2,500 a year from a pension for work he completed abroad, okay? May provides more than 50% of Lynn's support and claims Lynn, her father, and Michael, her son, as tax dependents. The household income is $46,000 a year, which is 200% of the federal poverty line. Lynn is eligible for marketplace coverage. He is eligible to enroll in a marketplace plan with subsidies, even though he's 65, he's over 65. He's not eligible for Medicare Part A without a premium based off of his work history. Next slide, please. So what's really important to think about in this example is that if a person can be claimed as a tax dependent, they must indicate that when they're applying for coverage. So I will tell you, lots of times I've gotten the question in a similar example like this. Well, you know, could Lynn just apply on his own and, you know, get a tax credit, you know, based off of his income of, of $2,500 that he gets from abroad? And the answer really is that when you're applying for a premium tax credit, if an individual can be claimed as a tax dependent, they must indicate that when they are applying for PTC. And the big question is, can Lynn apply on his own for the PTC? Lynn qualifies as May's dependent. Lynn lives with May and is also her relative. May pays for more than half of his support. Lynn's gross income is less than $4,400 a year. So Lynn is May's tax dependent, so he cannot apply for PTC on his own as a household of one. He may be eligible for PTC, but it must must include May and her income on his application for health coverage. Important to note that if Lynn receives a PTC, May must file a tax return and reconcile his PTC on her return. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to cover before I turn it back over to Gabrielle is state residency for Marketplace Medicaid and CHIP. And I am speaking about residency in very general terms. When we go into the Medicaid and CHIP, especially Medicaid, rules about state residency, they're very dense. They can get, very into the weeds. But in general, for ACA marketplaces, Medicaid and CHIP, residency really is the state in which the individual lives and intends to reside, including without a fixed address, or has entered with a job commitment or seeking employment, whether or not currently employed, okay? This does not mean that they are promising to live in the state for 3 years, or it's not, there's no like look back period either to say, oh, has this individual lived here for the last 3 years to earn residence? That's not the case. But they do have to actually be living in the state, or for the marketplace, the language is a little bit different. It's called service area, but in general, that means state for the purposes of the marketplace, and that they intend to reside. And again, they don't have to have a fixed address, okay? They could also be coming in with a job commitment, as I mentioned before. To verify residency, states and marketplaces can accept self-attestation, and for the most part, I think most do. And they can use HHS, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, approved electronic sources to the extent that they exist, and that can, verify electronically the attestation of state residence. They can't require an individual to provide some type of proof of immigration status in order to prove their state residency. Next slide, please. Okay, so I lied. There's one more topic that I'm going to bring up, and this is premium tax credit related rules for people who are married that have non-resident status. And when I use the word non-resident status here, it is the term that is utilized within the context of tax filing for federal taxes. So to qualify for a premium tax credit, an applicant that is married must file taxes jointly with their spouse. So we know that that's a general rule for premium tax credit eligibility, right? If an individual is married, they have to file taxes jointly. There are some exceptions that I know were covered in another webinar, Beyond the Basics, and like maybe like if the spouse abandoned them or different things like that. It's pretty rare. So we have this general rule that some individuals who are non-residents bump up against, and makes it so that it's very difficult for them to be able to meet this rule, because certain people who are immigrants, they file their tax on Form 1040 NR, okay? And some people who have a non-immigrant visa, oftentimes students who have an F visa or people with a J or M or Q visa, they must file this form, the 1040 NR, because they can't meet the substantial presence test in their first 5 years in the US, okay? Very technical. I know that this is very technical, but people have bumped up against this in the past, and then they're kind of stumped. So we just want to make sure that we put it out there. Not that I think that this is something that you're going to memorize. Some of you might, but a lot of times this is more of a something important to just kind of trigger your memory, and later on, if you run into somebody in this situation, you can come back and look at these rules. And of course, you're always welcome to email us as well. So the Form 1040 NR, the tax form, does not allow most people who are married and have a non-resident immigration status to file jointly with their spouse. So they can't meet the joint filing requirement to claim a premium tax credit. So this basically disqualifies them from premium tax credit eligibility. So we share this with you because it kind of comes up from time to time, and it's just better to know up front than later on if things end up where the family doesn't realize that they're ineligible, and then later on come into contact with this further down the line, whether it's through the once they clear DMI, data matching issue, or whether it's at the tax filing time, which would be the worst time to figure this one out. And next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Gabrielle, who will talk a little bit about options for people ineligible for insurance affordability programs due to their status.
Thanks, Shelby. Next slide, please. So generally, given the marketplace's broad eligibility standards for lawfully present people, the people who are not going to have marketplace eligibility are people who are either undocumented or who have DACA. Those people are simply not eligible to buy plans on the marketplace, even if they were to pay full price. Now, they can go to an insurance broker or other seller and buy private coverage, which, plans just like you would get through the marketplace, but buy them outside the marketplace. There's also nothing that prevents them from getting employer-based coverage, either through their own employer or as dependents of somebody who's getting it through their employer. And we do an annual survey that indicates that the majority of DACA recipients do have employer-based coverage. One barrier that people can come up against when they are undocumented and trying to buy coverage on the individual market is that they may not have a social security number. There's no requirement that an individual have a social security number in order to buy an insurance plan, but brokers often think that. So if you have a person who's just running into an intractable obstacle, attempting to buy a plan because they don't have a social security number, reach out to me, and we have some responses that brokers are generally satisfied with. Next slide, please. Okay, and then even though an individual might be ineligible to purchase coverage. So for example, a person is undocumented, but they have citizen children, they can apply for coverage for their eligible family members. And that would be ACA coverage as well as Medicaid. and they can be part of the household with their eligible family members. Now, if a person is the tax filer for the household and not eligible, even if they're not eligible for themselves, they need to file a tax return if they are applying for premium tax credits on behalf of their eligible family members. If they're not eligible for Social Security number, it is possible to obtain an alternative taxpayer number called an individual taxpayer identification number in order to file taxes. Next slide. In addition, people who meet all of their state's eligibility requirements for Medicaid, except for their immigration status, are eligible to obtain Medicaid coverage for emergency medical services. So people who fall in that category might include people who have a qualified status, but they're in that 5-year bar and have not obtain marketplace coverage, or people who are lawfully present but are not qualified and therefore unable to get Medicaid, as well as people who are undocumented and people with DACA. Some states allow people to enroll for emergency Medicaid ahead of incurring an actual emergency. In other states, that's something that's actually done at the hospital, either shortly after or concurrent with receiving services. Next slide. And then there are a number of programs that don't have immigration status eligibility restrictions. So those are programs that are funded with federal healthcare block grants, which include mental health, generally crisis services, maternal and child health programs, family planning, programs for the treatment of communicable diseases, including COVID, and immunizations. Programs that are providing health services that are necessary to protect life or safety, and those include emergency medical, food, or shelter programs, mental health crisis services, services for survivors of domestic violence or other crimes, as well as disaster relief services. There are no immigration status restrictions associated with hospital financial assistance programs, which are sometimes called charity care, as well as with access to community health centers, which includes federally qualified health centers and migrant health centers. And then depending on what state you're in, there may be some additional state or even locally funded programs that provide services to people. Next slide. Okay, shifting gears, we just wanted to provide a brief update on the status of public charge. Next slide. So public charge is what's called a grounds of inadmissibility in immigration law. So it's a grounds for saying that a person either cannot come into the country or cannot become a permanent resident. And public charge is actually assessed looking into the future to determine, based on all of the facts and circumstances that are present, whether the person is likely to become a public charge in the future. A public charge is a person who is dependent on the government for support. So there's a lot of concern about whether using public programs will make a person ineligible for LPR status as likely to become a public charge. Now, last month, or earlier this month actually, the administration published their final regulations on public charge. Those regulations are slated to take effect on December 23rd. There is always the possibility that their implementation will be delayed by litigation. However, the new regulations largely codify the 1999 field guidance, which is the policy that is in place currently. Under both the 1999 field guidance and the new regulations, assessing health insurance affordability programs will not be considered a negative factor for purposes of the public charge assessment. The only exception there is institutionalization for long-term care. And programs that are not considered in the public charge assessment include any financial assistance obtained through marketplace in conjunction with marketplace coverage, CHIP, and then Medicaid for any service other than long-term institutionalization. Next slide. So again, under both these policies, officials are going to try to determine whether the individual is likely to become primarily dependent on the government in the future. And they will be defining that as being dependent on public cash assistance for income maintenance, which is a cash grant intended to pay a person's day-to-day living expenses, not cash for a particular purpose like disaster assistance, or long-term institutional care paid for by the government, generally Medicaid. Any benefits other than those two are not negatively factored into the public charge assessment. Next slide. Now, the 1999 policy will continue in effect until at least December 23rd. When the new policy goes into effect, it does incorporate some helpful clarifications. So those include that long-term care does not include short-term rehabilitation. So for example, if somebody has COVID, they're in the hospital, and then they go to a step-down facility, which is a residential facility, but it's for rehabilitation purposes, that service would not be considered negatively in a public charge test. Imprisonment, similarly, as well as home and community-based services, which is often a point of confusion. And then an important clarification is that receipt of the benefit only counts when the person seeking the immigration status, so lawful permanent resident status, was the actual beneficiary of the benefits. Under the current policy, if you have a household where a child-only cash grant, typically through TANF, is the only apparent source of financial support for the family, that could be considered against another member of the household. So this clarification will be very helpful in addressing that particular issue. Next slide. Okay, so again, immigrants and their family members have really faced a lot of fear and confusion related to public charge. And as a result, people have not been obtaining health coverage, food assistance, other kinds of supports, including during the pandemic, and which is ongoing. Enrollment assisters can play an important role in helping people to understand that their participation in health insurance programs is not a factor in public charge. And they can share resources, provide information about the importance of getting health care, as well as providing information about the privacy protections related to public charge. We have a number of different resources that are made available through the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, one of NILC's projects, and those include some basic consumer-facing materials on public charge, as well as a Keep Your Benefits tool that enable people to assess their individual situation and the likelihood that they would be subject to a public charge determination. Next slide. Now, there are a number of important protections related to privacy that exist within healthcare affordability programs. And this is related to, but above and beyond, concerns about the public charge. So sometimes people are worried that applying for health coverage, even for somebody in the household who's a citizen, could expose the presence of non-citizens in the households. And there are privacy protections at both the state and federal level in all of the healthcare affordability programs, including the ACA marketplaces, Medicaid, and CHIP. All of these programs limit the use of information collected for purposes of program administration, like eligibility determination, and protect it from unauthorized disclosure. Workers who have access to the information are required to keep it secure. And we do have resources available through our website about both what those protections are in detail, as well as how to address families' concerns related to privacy issues. Next slide. Okay, turning it back to Shelby.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And I think that we're going to pause really quickly and answer a couple of questions. I think that there were some questions about slide 18 in particular, where I know it's super confusing. So if we could go back to slide 18, that would be great. And I'll try and go over that. There were 2 questions on that slide. And while we go back to slide 18, there was a question about SSNs. If an individual is applying and does not have a social security number, yes, they indeed will be asked for social security number, and they'll be asked for social security number numerous times during the application. And you should never provide a social security number, or like, pretend numbers like 999 or whatever. Just go ahead and skip the question. Okay. And then going back to slide 18, we,
I can set up the example so we can kind of,
okay.
it's hard to find the slides. There's a lot of slides in this presentation.
Okay.
So that example.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no. So that example had Adnan. Oh, here we go. I think we're getting to it. Had Adnan and Gina, and essentially there's confusion because it is confusing. So Adnan and Gina, their income is below 100% of the federal poverty line. And actually we're not seeing the slides right now. Okay, cool. So Adnan is eligible for Medicaid based on his immigration status. Gina is not. And so we have the 2 examples, one in a state that has expanded Medicaid and one that has not expanded Medicaid. And as you can see on the screen, even though Adnan is eligible for Medicaid, we have on our chart that it says he is not eligible for Medicaid. And I understand why that is confusing. So I'll let Shelby take it away to just kind of clarify that point.
Yes. Thank you so much, Hallie and Jenny, for getting us to the slide. So here's the deal. In this case, we're in a state that has not expanded Medicaid. Okay. So when we talk about whether or not Adnan, when we think about his eligibility based off of immigration status, his immigration status being a lawful permanent resident, he's not subject to the 5-year bar because he also has a refugee status, right? So he's one of these special cases that is, even though he is a lawful permanent resident, he also has refugee status. Refugee status means you're not subject to the 5-year bar, right? So he meets the Medicaid related immigration status requirements to enroll in Medicaid. And his state has not expanded Medicaid. So he doesn't qualify for this special rule that I kind of described in the other example where his wife, Gina, right? She does qualify for this special exception for PTC eligibility, even though her income is below the federal poverty line. And the reason why she's eligible is because her immigration status, she's lawfully present, but she's ineligible for Medicaid based off of the stricter Medicaid eligibility based off of immigration status requirement. So Adnan is treated just as a citizen would be in the coverage gap because he's not eligible for Medicaid because he's in the coverage gap in this scenario, and he's not eligible for premium tax credits because he doesn't fit the very kind of narrow set of circumstances that his wife fits into, where she is lawfully present but ineligible for Medicaid based off her immigration status. He is eligible for Medicaid based off his immigration status. So I know it's super confusing, but that is how the rule plays out.
And then I think we'll keep going. We have a lot more of the presentation going through kind of the application, and I know that we're close to time, but we're going to get through what we can. And we also, again, are recording this. And so for anyone who has to leave at the top of the hour, we will post the recording on our website after the webinar. So I'll let Jenny get to our slides and take it away, Shelby.
Thank you. And what we will do is I'm going to run really quickly through this. And part of it is because I'm just going to go, the beginning of this section is all information that we're going to cover in an upcoming webinar where we go over data matching issues and verification, how that plays out within Medicaid and in the marketplace. So next slide, please. At a very broadly speaking, in general, the marketplace is going to be trying to verify people's citizenship and immigration status with data matching that they do with either the Social Security Administration, which generally can help to verify US citizenship, or the United States Department of Homeland Security SAVE system, which generally is used to verify immigration status, and in some cases, also citizenship status for individuals who were not born within the US, okay? And the way that they do that is that they do data matching using a Social Security number for individuals who are US, who say they are US citizen on the application. They use that to data match with the Social Security Administration. And for those who are either born outside of the US and US citizens, or for those who are who immigrated to the US, those individuals will share some numbers from their immigration related documentation, and that information is shared with the US Department of Homeland Security SAVE system. Next slide, please. So this is basically what I just went over. The first thing that's going to happen is that the applicant will be asked to provide a Social Security number. And if the individual does provide a Social Security number, again, how I mentioned beforehand, individuals who don't have Social Security numbers leave that question blank on healthcare.gov, okay? Applicants will attest to being a US citizen. They'll be asked, is Jane, who is our applicant in this scenario, a US citizen or national? If she says yes, then sometimes that's the end of the questions, because healthcare.gov will do a data check with Social Security number, and if all is good, then they just keep on moving on. If they need more, they aren't able to substantiate the citizenship claim, then what they will do is they will first ask if Jane is a naturalized or derived citizen, and if that's the case, Jane will say yes or no, right? So if she says yes, then she will be asked to provide a naturalization certificate or certificate of citizenship and related numbers to those documents, okay? Next slide. For individuals who the system is not able to electronically verify their citizenship in real time, it does not mean that they're not citizens. It just means that they're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way and provide some kind of proof of citizenship. And usually this is a US passport is the best, because that's just one piece of documentation that an individual would have to provide. Here are some other examples of other documents that it would be enough to just with one document be able to verify citizenship here on this page. That includes certificate of citizenship, and I won't read the rest of them. Next slide, please. If, however, the individual does not have one of those pieces of documents, then they're going to have to send in two pieces of documentation. One of the pieces of documentation from the left side of this chart, and the second piece of documentation from the list on the right side. On the left side, you're basically, in general, trying to show that the person has citizenship. The second document is generally trying to prove identity. Together, they create a full documentation of citizenship for eligibility purposes. Next slide, please. For an individual who is not a US citizen, they would say no to the questions that we saw earlier, and then they would ask if the individual has an eligible immigration status. And if you're not sure, then they go back to a list very similar to the list that Gabrielle shared with us earlier, just probably ordered in a different way or just looks different, but it's the same statuses, right? So they're going to say, does Jane have an eligible immigration status? They're going to show all of the lawfully present, lawfully residing statuses, all of them, every single one of them, right? And Jane is going to look through that list and she's going to say yes or no. And that is going to be an attestation as to whether or not she is eligible based off of immigration status. Remembering that DACA, there will even be something that says, this does not include DACA. DACA, say no if you're not, if you're not eligible. If you have DACA, you don't say that yes, that you have an eligible immigration status. So that's important to note. And I think there was a question about that on the application. Then the individual will be asked to provide, select one of these kinds of documents to see which, depending on what that individual has for their immigration related documentation. And then based off of what they select here, in the next slide, you will see that they will ask for specific numbers that are related to the document that the individual identifies as the kind of document that they have. Next slide, please. And the next slide will show just more documents and other documents as well. And then we have a bunch of tips about how to enter in some documents, just in case, especially because there's some people who have very old documents and the kind of labeling is confusing. The labeling is not consistent throughout. Both on healthcare.gov as well as on Beyond the Basics, we have some resources that go through a lot of different ways that the numbers might come up. I would go and look and see what's on healthcare.gov these days, because they probably have a more fulsome list of documents examples and how they might, which numbers we're looking for. All of this, again, is not stuff that you have to memorize. There are tools out there that can help. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier this and we just talked about this, a little bit when we went back over the slide 18. But when we think about the premium tax credits for people who are lawfully present or residing, but they're ineligible for Medicaid due to their status, not only is it confusing to explain these rules, it's confusing to get the right eligibility determination to happen for individuals who are in this situation. And as you can imagine, that's a lot to program in a computer system, right? Because you have to basically, in some cases, basically have to prove that you're ineligible for Medicaid based off of your immigration status before the system will really understand and know that you're eligible for marketplace coverage with a premium tax credit, okay? So if healthcare.gov can't electronically verify an individual's immigration status through SAVE, the Department of Homeland Security system that I talked about earlier, if that immigration status can't happen in real time, which oftentimes it can't, because there's all sorts of kind of clunky reasons, right? Like systems are not perfect, they're not updated all the time. There's a lot of human error that goes into picking the right numbers. All sorts of things could happen, right? People's names change, all sorts of stuff can happen. So if the person gets gets what we call a data matching issue, and then has to provide paper documentation to prove that they have their immigration status, whatever that immigration status is, the individual, what the computer is going to do, the computer is going to think that if the person otherwise is eligible for Medicaid based off of what their income would be, that person is going to be sent to Medicaid while they try and figure out the data match, or they're going to be treated as if they said, I fully am eligible based off of my immigration status for the program that I happen to also have my income eligibility assigned to, right? So in the case that the individual has income in the Medicaid limit, in the Medicaid range, they're going to be sent to Medicaid, okay? If their income is below 100% of the poverty line, but they're not otherwise eligible for Medicaid, so they otherwise, like Adnan on slide 18, appears to be in the coverage gap, then what's going to happen Or let's think about Gina on slide 18, right? Like, let's say her temporary protected status couldn't be verified in real time. She's going to be told, you can enroll in marketplace coverage, but you're not eligible for PTCs, premium tax credits, or cost sharing reductions right now. Can you send us your proof of immigration status? So she's going to think that, boy, is it expensive to buy coverage in the marketplace, even though once she has had her immigration status cleared and verified, they will know, oh, this is a person who's ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status. Now we can show that she's fully eligible for premium tax credits, but the computer isn't going to know that in real time. So a lot of people get very confusing eligibility results when they're completing the Medicaid application. Okay, we're telling you this because we do know a lot of people run into this situation, and it's extraordinarily helpful if you're able to catch it and help them understand why it's important to go ahead and submit their immigration documents and get this process going so that they can get the right eligibility determination for PTCs. Next slide, please. So if a person appears eligible for Medicaid based on their income and other factors, the marketplace assesses or determines the person is eligible for Medicaid, and the case is sent to the Medicaid agency for further eligibility review, including verification of their immigration status. The Medicaid agency is going to then notify the applicant that proof is needed, including but not limited to immigration status. So sometimes the Medicaid agency might say, yeah, you got to prove your immigration status, and we also want you to prove your income, right? Like, so there might be a lot of steps in this process. If the applicant sends in proof and is determined ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, the Medicaid agency will send the applicant a denial notice, and the case is referred back to the marketplace. The marketplace sends a notice to the person and says, hey, come back to the marketplace, and it gives them instructions on how to get the correct eligibility determination, which basically starts with indicate that you were found to be ineligible for Medicaid based off your immigration status. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. Applicants return to the marketplace, they indicate that they've been denied Medicaid based off of their immigration status, and they provide any other information that's needed, and then the correct eligibility determination is done for PTCs and cost sharing reductions. So next slide. This is what it looks like. So they are basically going to be asked to attest that they were denied eligibility based off their immigration status, and other questions about their status and how long they've had it, that kind of thing. And then next slide, please. So what happens in the case where a person is treated as if they're in the coverage gap? So in this case, the person wasn't sent to Medicaid, right? This was the Gina case that I was pretending we were staying in the marketplace for beforehand. So this is when an individual's income is below the poverty line and not otherwise eligible for Medicaid, right? So let's say that this person was in a state that did not expand Medicaid, and they don't meet the very, very strict requirements for Medicaid otherwise, right? So the marketplace determines that the applicant can enroll in coverage without a PTC and notifies the applicant that they may qualify for help paying for coverage, but proof of their immigration status is needed to make that determination. The applicant then sends in proof, and then the case is sent to a special unit in healthcare.gov, and then they will try to identify whether or not the individual is eligible or ineligible based off their immigration status for Medicaid, right? If the person is determined ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, then the marketplace notifies the applicant about eligibility for subsidies and will provide also special enrollment if the individual needs one to enroll at that point in time. So the applicant returns to the marketplace, they select the PTC and select the plan with a PTC and CSR. So that is how it goes. Next slide, please. And we have provided some resources, and then I'm going to turn it over for the next slide to either Hallie or Hallie, I think, who will
I can
talk
do
about
that.
it.
And I know that you guys can't click on any of these links on the slide. So the slides, I'll put a link to the slides in the chat in just a moment. Again, we'll also send them out after the webinar, and we'll post everything to our Beyond the Basics website. So you can always check there. We'll have this recording there. We wanted to do a special two special shout outs. A lot of these application questions and going through documents and all of the things that Shelby was just talking about, we're going to go through those in even more detail on the preventing and resolving data matching issues on Tuesday, October 4th. So definitely tune into that one. And also this year, we're really excited. We're going to be doing our first Beyond the Basics webinar entirely in Spanish. And it will be about how to assist your Spanish speaking clients. And so that will actually be on Thursday, October 20th. Again, it'll be entirely in Spanish, and we're really excited about that. So please spread the word for that particular webinar. Because we're past the hour, I think we'll pause on questions. I know we couldn't answer everyone's questions, but you are welcome to email us at beyondthebasics@cbpp.org. You also can see Shelby's email and Gabrielle's email on our screen here, so you can email them directly as well. We want to give a really special thank you to the National Immigration Law Center and to Gabrielle in particular for partnering with us. They have just been a huge help in presenting this material, getting it together, and have partnered with us for a long time now, which is very exciting. As always, we're going to be distributing everything from today's webinar, including the recording of this webinar, and you can always find additional resources on our website. And again, if you have questions, email that Beyond the Basics email. And we do have a record of your questions. So there are a couple specific ones that we'll have a record of. And I think with that, we will bring this to a close. Thank you so much again, everyone. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you back. We actually have another webinar on Thursday for plan design, and then sort of navigating, putting together plan selection strategies the following Thursday, and data matching issue, I suppose, on the 4th. We have lots of upcoming webinars. So thank you again so much, everyone. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you hopefully on Thursday. Thanks.